Tonight I'll be presenting one project, and it's titled The Women of April and the 1965 U.S. Invasion of Dominican Republic. And at the end, I'm also going to share a couple of images from different projects. And I'm just going to read my opening statement. This research-based project is about remembrance as a way to reclaim stories that I didn't know I carried. Memories offer us a basis to find meaning and integration. Remembrance is also a path to discovery, and it was through the research that I discovered the Women of April. They were civilian resistance fighters during the 1965 revolution and U.S. invasion of Dominican Republic. Lastly, remembrance can teach us that the past is still present and that history does repeat itself. The aftershock of the U.S. invasion is still with us in the form of the Dominican diaspora, which is now the fourth largest Latino community in the U.S. So how many of you know about the April 1965 revolution in Dominican Republic? Show of hands. And how many of you know why the U.S. invaded Dominican Republic in 1965? Okay, so you're not alone. I didn't know either, I didn't have answers for either question when I started the research. And I began the project during an artist residency at el Museo del Barrio in the summer of 2017. And this is my first political body of work. And the cartoon image on the right is sort of like a laundry list, and it lists 3 factors that led to April 1965. So the first is colonialism. DR was the first Spanish colony. U.S. imperialism, Yankee imperialism. DR had been invaded and occupied by the U.S. before. And it also has the DR government corruption. It also has like a long history of dictators and corrupt government. So briefly, on April 28th, 1965, the U.S. sent in 42,000 Marines in response to a presidential coup. And the invasion is the subject of the image on the left, which is titled Boots on the Ground. So why did the revolution happen? By 1965, Trujillo had been dead for 4 years. He was a dictator. He had been in power for 33 years. And he was assassinated in '61 by the CIA. And it was the first time, like a year after his death, it was the first time Dominicans were able to have free elections in like 33 years on the island. And so they selected somebody, they voted for somebody who was a social democrat, like Bernie Sanders, pro-labor reform. And he also was introducing like a new constitution to kind of improve the life of Dominicans. And his name was Juan Bosch, and he was elected with an overwhelming majority, like 60% of the people voted for him. He was in office for 7 months, and then he was replaced by Lyndon B. Johnson with a military government. He was exiled to Puerto Rico, and the resistance really happened in *65 to try to overturn the military government that LBJ had put into place. And essentially, they wanted to return their legitimately, elected president back to office. So the image on the right is a satirical portrait of Trujillo, and this is actually one of a handful of images where I started to integrate humor and art and politics to kind of support the narrative of this history. And the one on the left is a portrait of Trujillo, but the anatomy of a dictator is, the sort of the character traits of really any authoritarian leader. This is a shot of the installation that I created at El Museo, and I was there for a period of 3 months. And so after our last presidential elections, I was really concerned with all the anti-immigrant policies that were being, rolled out. And I began to think about my own immigration story. I wasn't born here, I'm an immigrant. And I wanted to understand how Trujillo's assassination and the invasion that followed had really led to my parents' migration to New York City. So I decided to document their migration journey, and I actually took an old family album, and I began to draw, like I began research, and I began to draw directly into the album. There were 20 pages, and I drew like on the front and the back. The family album, I think, was like 30 years old, and it had like a yellow kind of dry glue patina, so it was really interesting to work on the surface. So the smaller images are from the album, and these are actually digital prints because, of course, the images are in a book. The originals are in a book. And they basically map out the history of the events that led to 65. And the sort of the art-making process was really organic. I did research, and then I just would kind of respond to some images and make work from that. But I used a lot of different sources to make the image, some historical photographs. I used personal stories that a lot of museum visitors shared with me. I also used poetry. I also used scripture from the Bible, and just really my own invention or like recreation of some of the history that I read. And the larger images are the women of April. And as I said, I didn't know anything about the history, so I was like really shocked and delighted to learn about these women. And they were civilian resistance fighters who actually fought the 42,000 Marines. You know, I mean, the Dominicans really didn't have like a resistance force that could, take on 42,000 Marines. And so a lot of civilians really, fought the Marines, and thousands of them were women. And so when I learned their history, the large format images really became a documentation of the women. So these are charcoal images, and they range in size from like, some of them are 10 feet to like 6 feet high, and they're all 2 feet wide. And I really wanted the women to be totemic. They were sort of, the format is inspired by the semi-sculpture that were created by the Taino people, and the Taino were the indigenous people of Dominican Republic. And the semis were created to house ancestral spirits. And as I learned the stories of the women, I really began to think of them as ancestors. And so this is what informed the formatting. And I chose, I did a couple of series of the women, but this is the first, and this is all like charcoal on paper. And I really wanted to capture their energy and also the kind of immediate response to like an invading army. So most of the women, as I said, were just civilians. There were a handful of them that were kind of the leaders of the movement that were actual revolutionaries. And they had trained in Cuba, and they had actually been resisting the Trujillo government for a long time. So they were the ones that were actually trying to train the other women on how to like shoot a gun or really just fight. The women ranged in age and occupation, and the woman on the far left is Piqui Lora, and she was an actual revolutionary, but she was also an attorney. The woman to her right is actually a 15-year-old. Her name was Tina La Bazuquera. And she was an incredible marksman, so that was why she was nicknamed La Bazuquera, because she was really good with a bazooka. And she was killed in the conflict. And then the woman next to her is La Coronela, who really was like a leader in a lot of significant battles. And the last woman on the far right is really like an invented woman of April, from the Dominican diaspora. So I mentioned, one of the things that I discovered is that the history was really actually a mirror of current events. And one of the patterns that I discovered were like the foreign alliances and how they actually enable, authoritarian governments. And so on the left is an image of Nixon and Trujillo, and Nixon was an ambassador to Dominican Republic under Eisenhower. And on the right is General Franco, who was like one of the worst dictators in Europe. And they were quite close. They were intimate friends. They visited each other quite a bit. And Franco was actually godfather to Trujillo's grandkids. So the other pattern that I discovered was the nature of the immigration policy. Dominican Republic had been one of the few nations that actually took in Jewish refugees when they were fleeing, the Nazis in Europe. And they essentially were welcomed by Trujillo because he wanted to make the country white. And he really wanted to make it like more Eurocentric. And so they were given land in the northeast part of the island and in a place called Sosua, and there they created a kibbutz, they built a synagogue, and they really thrived. And when I was at El Museo, I actually met a woman who was born, she's a Jewish woman, she was born in DR. Her father had been one of the original settlers of this kibbutz. So she was like really delighted to see the images, and she's also an artist, so that was kind of a cool connection. But she grew up thinking that Trujillo had been a good guy because essentially he did rescue her family and another, kind of like 1,000 Jewish people. So in contrast, immigrants of color, in particular the Haitians, were targeted and scapegoated not only by Dominicans, but definitely by government policies. And even to this day, Haitians continue to be targeted. And I think what we call anti-Haitianism really became entrenched under Trujillo, and it's sort of like part of the policy today. So a couple of years ago, the Dominican government rewrote the Constitution and actually stripped a lot of Haitians of their citizenship. And, so now they're nationless. This image is showing sugarcane workers, agricultural workers lining up for water. And I really wanted, if you can see like the ominous clouds, and I really wanted to show the men sort of spilling out of the image to kind of highlight the imbalance and the kind of injustice that they were, experiencing. And so the government was really preoccupied with law and order. On the left, you have, government state-sanctioned violence, so any kind of dissent was punished. And on the right, you have, this is a scene from La Matanza, and it's known as the Parsley Massacre, where, and this was carried out by Trujillo's military and also like private militia. And they estimate that between 18,000 and 25,000 Haitians were killed over a period of a week. So the most iconic resistance fighters in Dominican history, and I think they're probably the most well-known, are Las Hermanas Mirabal. And so it's Minerva, Patria, and Maria Teresa. And their nickname was the Butterflies, and they were actively resisting Trujillo until they were killed by Trujillo himself. And there's a wonderful book by Julia Alvarez, In the Time of Butterflies, which is, about their story. So they were so beloved by the Dominican people that I think it was a watershed moment when they were killed. And 6 months later, Trujillo himself would be killed. So his car was ambushed, and it was, it was carried out by people from his inner circle, but it was orchestrated by the CIA. And one of his assassins is quoted as saying, "This hawk will no longer hunt chickens," which is the image on the right. Este gavilán no come más pollo. And one of the reasons I restricted the palette to just ink and, darks is that I was really interested in emphasizing the shadows. When you go to the Caribbean, the light is so bright, and it really makes the shadows very dense and almost as heavy as the forms that are casting it. And I really thought it was like a good kind of metaphor for the history, that really, and this darkness, it really coexisted with the light of the Caribbean. So all of these events led to the revolution and to the American invasion. And when the American invasion was over, 6,000 Dominicans, mostly civilians, were dead, and 44 US troops were killed. So it was in Ciudad Nueva that the US Marines initially landed and invaded DR. And Ciudad Nueva it means the new city, and it was named the new city by the Spaniards because it was the first city in the Americas. And so it kind of mirrored the original occupation, by Columbus and the Spaniards. And the reason they were in Ciudad Nueva is that there was a high concentration of resistance fighters. And so a lot of the fighting and destruction happened there. And it was also where my family lived. So we were actually displaced when the invasion happened. And our family was essentially separated. We stayed with our grandparents who lived in like the northwest part of the island. And they had a big farm. And then my father had to flee really quickly. And so the image on the right, Tag You're In, is really an allegory to kind of illustrate the sort of imbalance of power, this 42,000 Marines and, the Dominican people. I mean, there was really no match. I mean, it wasn't a fair match. And that image actually would go on to kind of take another meaning, and it'll show up again in the presentation a little bit later. So the resistance was essentially el pueblo, which means the people. So it means children and women and men. And on the left, you see kids making Molotov cocktails. And on the right, you see the impact of the US military on Santo Domingo. So when the resistance won a battle, and they did win several battles, they would confiscate guns. Again, it was a really poor country, and they didn't really have like a lot of weapons. So they would confiscate guns and tanks, and they would be tagged with Pueblo. And people that were not fighting, and the people that fought were actually like a really broad cross-section from a lot of socioeconomic levels. So poor people, middle class, professional, academics. It was just really like a cross-section of Dominican people. But those that were not engaged in fighting were protesting. And you could see there's a placard, Constitution 1963. And that was the new constitution that Juan Bosch, who had been elected, had created. And so they were still clamoring to have that, instituted, and they still wanted their president back. So to protect American lives, and that was the reason that LBJ gave for the invasion. And so Americans were not really in danger in Dominican Republic because essentially the coup happened because they wanted to have their president returned. So I mean, it's a complex history, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Americans partied in DR, like they partied in Cuba, so there was a lot of, it was essentially a playground. And these images are also based on a conversation I had with another museum visitor who, and this was really random and interesting. She used to vacation in Dominican Republic and in the 60s, and she was actually friends with the guy who was in charge of the military government. His name was Donald Reed. And she said their families vacationed together, and she was there when the Marines had to airlift Americans out and also were airlifting Donald Reed out. And she couldn't understand why they had been overthrown, and she just said to me, they were really fine beach companions, and so that's what I titled these two. I just thought it was a funny comment. And so the reason for the invasion was really corporate interests. American companies owned a significant amount of land, agricultural land. I think we've all heard the term Banana Republic. And they also owned like the sugarcane farms and tobacco. And this is why any kind of labor reform would have been a threat, because it would have definitely impacted the bottom line. Because they had really cheap labor to extract the resources. And when Trujillo was killed, he and his family owned 51% of the GNP, of the Dominican GNP. And American investors owned 42%, and Dominicans owned 7%. So it was, still essentially a colony. This is a pretty large, this is like 7 feet long. It's charcoal and some collage elements. And, essentially the invasion was the push factor for immigration. And this is when Dominicans started to flee, which eventually led to the diaspora. And in May of this year, I began doing my, what I call the Dominican Garnica, and these are just studies for that. And so it's not Guernica in terms of the visual language of the, that famous Guernica, but it's more about the content. My Guernica is about the night when the Americans invaded. And I'm using a lot of the imagery is coming out of a poem which was written by a Dominican poet by the name of Alexis Gomez Rosa. And it's an epic poem, so it's like a really long poem, and it's this young Dominican boy who's kind of walking through Santo Domingo as the Americans are invading, and he's like watching this kind of, the machinery of war kind of like take over the island. And this is another series of the Women of April. So the smaller images of the women is when I began to introduce color. And this is an invented image of the invasion, which began with like a flood of helicopters. So this is, just sort of like my own imagined scene. And the name of the piece is the title of the poem by Alexis Gomez, which means Truce of the Mammals. So, as I mentioned, the women were civilians. On the right, you have Mercedes Ramirez. She was a teen mother who actually left her kid in her village, and she came into the city, so she could fight. And there were so many women that wanted to fight that they kind of created this academy, this kind of makeshift military academy, so they could give the women like some basic training. And these are 2 other women, historical women that fought during the invasion. And on the left, you have Hilda Gattreau, who was a civil rights attorney, and she advocated for a lot of political prisoners and dissidents. And she was actually killed during the conflict. And on the right is just sort of like an invented Woman of April, seamstress, mother, wife. So here I began to introduce sort of like text and symbols that referenced the sort of goddess archetypes. And the image on the right, you see there's text in the back, and colmado means grocery store. And the name of this colmado is Aset, and Aset is actually another name for the Egyptian goddess Isis. And she is known, she was like really revered in Egypt, but she's known for like encompassing like all divine feminine powers. And whenever you see images of Isis, and I didn't want to put Isis on this because it would have like a different connotation, but whenever you see, images of Isis, she has like a hieroglyph on her head. And so this Isis has the curlers, which is really like a cultural reference. A lot of the photographs of the women with their guns, the women actually had their hair up in curlers, so it's a very kind of Dominican thing to like really, be concerned about your hair, even during a revolution, so it was kind of humorous. The woman on the left is like an older Woman of April, and the upper right-hand corner, you see the colors of the Dominican flag, but they're sort of been dismantled and rearranged. So one of the ways that history is still present is that it repeats itself, and both of these images are completely spoofing Trump. And the image on the left is a large graphite portrait, and the image on the right, again, came from a conversation with someone who was lamenting their vote for Trump, and I was thinking to myself, well, you kiss a frog and you think it's going to turn into a prince, but this frog is not a prince. And it's about greed, and corruption. So the legacy of Trujillo did not end with the revolution or the invasion. I call this like the legacy of enablers. The image on the left is, you see Margarita. Trujillo had 2 sons and a daughter, and so here she's holding like a fictional, copy of Life magazine. Trujillo's on the cover, and Balaguer is on the back, and I call this a Dominican math problem. So after the 31 years of Trujillo, and then the revolution and the invasion, Lyndon B. Johnson installed Balaguer as president, and he would be in power for 22 years. And the first 12 years were just a complete purge of anybody who had been involved in the resistance during the revolution invasion. And it was actually one of the bloodiest periods in DR. And this is when you will see like the second wave of Dominicans in like the early 1980s. It was under Balaguer, and he especially targeted journalists. So it was like a very, it was a really frightening time. And I think it's also part of the reason why a lot of Dominican immigrants never talk about the history, because there was just so much fear, and I think it's just like inherited. And so here, again, you see like the echoing, the targeting of journalists on the left, the murder of Khashoggi, and the image on the right is Ivanka, and it's about greed. And I call this the Baron and the Baroness, based on the robber baron phrase. So nepotism. Trujillo had, 2 sons and a daughter, and they were in the government. They weren't necessarily qualified to be in the government, but they were. So, we can see that again. And Margarita, the 2 brothers actually had really tragic deaths, but Margarita actually retired in Miami, and she would write a memoir about her father and, really whitewashing the history. So this is another pattern, which is the scapegoating of immigrants. And, this kind of brings us full circle, which is where I started and why I started the project. And the image on the left was the image that you saw earlier about the invasion. And it essentially became like an illustration of the child separation policy that we see now. The image on the right is again about the ICE raids and targeting immigrants at the border. So I began the project a few months after the Women's March in DC, and I attended, and I was like really inspired and really invigorated. And these are universal women of April. They don't have guns, and I think we see a lot of women activists today. And I think it's actually, women's activism is like a real catalyst for change. And so I think, very much like it was in April 1965. And this is titled Fuera, which means get out. So, and so this is about the power of women's rage. And this is like a mashup between sort of religious imagery and revolutionary imagery. And it's based on a scripture from the Gospel of Luke, which is called the Magnificat. And it's a very lyrical and beautiful passage, but there are 4 lines that are very, it's really like a battle cry. And it's been, considered so threatening that it's actually been banned in several countries at different times in history. So it was banned in Chile under Pinochet. It was banned in India, in Guatemala. Yeah. And at this point, I started to kind of introduce some of the religious imagery. This is a recent image from this year. I was working in a church. I had a studio there, so some of the imagery and the subjects began to find themselves into the work, make themselves into the work. So this is another project, and this is my version of the Annunciation, and this happens, this is about 40 inches by 50 inches, and this is happening on the number 7 train in Queens, and it's really about creativity. It's not meant to be religious, it's really just about the invitation for artists to create, really. And this is a cityscape from another body of work. I did a lot of cityscapes the last year or so, and it's about the development and the kind of erasure of communities and people in the city, which is happening. And the title of this piece is The Alchemist in the City, and this is based on a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. So I was looking at a lot of his poetry as well for some of the cityscapes. So this is actually the final image of the presentation. So thank you.